Faith isn't just belief. It's a journey that changed my life forever. Hello, my name is Emily Collins. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, faith has been a quiet companion in my life. Growing up in a small town in Yorkshire, England, I attended church every Sunday, sang in the choir, and believed in God with a heart full of hope. But despite the years of devotion, I often found myself tangled in fear, doubt, and worry. How could I believe in the same God as those who seemed unshaken by life's storms while I felt fragile and uncertain? It wasn't until a deeply personal journey that I realized faith isn't just about belief. It's a journey with different stages, each shaping us in unexpected ways. This is my story of discovering the 3 levels of faith God wants us to reach, and how each step pulled me closer to a peace I once thought impossible. The moment that changed everything began quietly, as many life-altering moments do. It was a chilly autumn evening in my hometown of Whitby, a quaint coastal village famous for its cobblestone streets and the ruins of an ancient abbey. I was sitting in my small flat, surrounded by unopened bills and the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing on my chest. My job at the local bookstore had just been cut due to budget cuts, and the savings I'd carefully built over the years were rapidly disappearing. The future looked bleak, and fear gnawed at me relentlessly. In that moment, I found myself reaching out, not with eloquence or certainty, but with a desperate cry from the depths of my soul. God, please help me, I whispered, hands trembling as I clutched the worn edges of my Bible. It was the kind of prayer that wasn't polished or proud. It was raw, like a child running to their parent after a fall. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I had to ask. That night marked the beginning of what I now understand as the first level of faith, the faith that asks. It's a faith born out of need, out of pain, and it's where many of us start, even if we don't realize it at the time. In the days that followed, I held onto that simple prayer like a lifeline. Each morning, I'd wake up with the same uneasy hope, repeating my plea quietly, "Please, God, show me a way." My faith felt fragile, sometimes trembling under the weight of doubt, but still I reached out. I remembered the story of a blind man from the Bible, who sat by the roadside shouting for mercy, ignored by the crowd, but relentless in his cry until Jesus finally stopped for him. Like that man, I shouted in my own way, though my voice was often barely a whisper. But life didn't immediately change. The silence was deafening. No job offers, no sudden miracles, just the same empty rooms and unpaid bills. I felt tempted to give up, to stop asking because it seemed pointless. Yet, somewhere deep inside, I sensed that this cry wasn't the end. It was the doorway. I began to realize that faith wasn't about getting immediate answers but about learning to lean into that silence and uncertainty. I started staying a little longer in the quiet after my prayers, letting that stillness fill the space where panic used to be. Slowly, my prayers shifted from desperate demands to quiet conversations, from begging for relief to asking, "Who are you to me in this moment?" It was awkward and uncomfortable, but I clung to it. I began to see that faith at this stage is not about perfect words or quick fixes. It's about trust that grows in the cracks of brokenness. Every time I brought my worries back to God instead of hiding them, something shifted inside me. Though the world outside remained unchanged, a quiet miracle was happening within. My heart was beginning to take root in a new kind of hope. As weeks turned into months, the weight of unanswered prayers settled heavily on my shoulders. My initial cries for help, the kind that burst out from sheer desperation, started to fade. It wasn't that I stopped praying, but my prayers became quieter, less about pleading and more about waiting. I found myself sitting in the stillness longer, staring out my window at the gray skies over Whitby's harbor, wondering why the doors I hoped would open remained firmly shut. This was the beginning of the second level of faith, a faith that trusts. It's a strange place to be, caught between hope and silence, where the absence of answers feels like a test of everything you believe. I understood, in a way I never had before, what it meant to trust God not because of what I saw, but because of who He is. It was like learning to walk in the dark, relying not on my own eyes, but on the steady hand guiding me forward. I thought of Abraham, who waited decades for a promise that seemed impossible, and Job, who suffered unimaginable loss yet refused to curse God. Their stories became my quiet anthem on days when my spirit flagged. I wasn't naive. I still felt fear and doubt creeping in, but I held onto a quiet confidence that God was working even when His presence felt hidden. During this season, I noticed how my prayers changed. Instead of demanding answers or quick fixes, I found myself simply saying, "Thank you," thanking God for what hadn't changed. My family, my health, the small blessings that still flickered in my life. My faith was no longer about chasing miracles. It was about resting in the goodness of God, even when the storm raged on. This steady trust, even in silence, became the anchor that kept me from drifting away. My journey through this season of silent waiting stretched on longer than I ever imagined it would. Some days, it felt like I was walking through a thick fog where nothing was clear, and every step was heavy with uncertainty. Yet, within that fog, something remarkable was happening to me. My faith was evolving. It was growing roots deep beneath the surface, unseen but strong. One morning, as I sat with a steaming cup of tea, the words from the Gospel of John came to mind. "Abide in me and I in you." Suddenly, I realized that my faith was moving into its third stage, the faith that abides. This was no longer about asking or even just trusting in God's plans. It was about living in His presence every single moment. It was about resting in Him, not striving or demanding, but simply being connected like a branch to a vine. I began to experience a quiet peace that didn't depend on my circumstances. Even though I still faced financial worries and daily struggles, inside, I felt a calm that nothing could shake. Prayer wasn't a frantic list of requests anymore. It became a gentle rhythm, a conversation where sometimes words weren't needed. I sensed God's nearness in the soft light of dawn, in the laughter of friends, and even in the silence that once frightened me. This abiding faith reshaped how I saw everything. I no longer felt the need to control outcomes or force answers. Instead, I found joy in simply being present with God, trusting that everything I needed would come in His perfect timing. It was a faith that didn't shout or demand but rested quietly, confident in God's unchanging love. This transformation was the greatest miracle of all. One that no one could see but that changed my heart forever. Yet, this calm and steady faith did not mean that life's challenges disappeared. In fact, the storms often seemed to grow fiercer, testing the strength of this new peace I had found. I remember one particularly harsh winter when the heating in my flat broke down, and I was left shivering in layers of blankets, wondering how I would manage the bills that stretched endlessly before me. The cold was biting, and the nights felt longer than ever. But instead of panic, something inside me held firm. I didn't have all the answers, nor did I know how the situation would resolve, but I felt anchored in a deep trust that God was with me. I thought about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, wrestling with anguish but surrendering to God's will. Like Him, I learned that abiding faith doesn't mean absence of struggle. It means surrendering the struggle itself to a higher peace. Even in the face of hardship, I began to notice small moments of grace. An unexpected kindness from a neighbor, a phone call from a friend, or a simple sunrise that reminded me of new beginnings. Those moments weren't miracles in the dramatic sense, but they were signs of God's steady presence. Faith that abides isn't about constant victory or easy days. It's about a quiet confidence that no matter what, we are held. I started to see that this stage of faith transforms us from the inside out. It softens our hearts, deepens our patience, and teaches us to love without conditions. It's a faith that frees us from the frantic chase for proof, and instead invites us to live fully within the mystery of God's love. It was in this place that I began to truly understand what it meant to rest in Him, no longer striving but simply being. But faith's journey is never straightforward. It is filled with tests that challenge every step we take. Between each stage, God places the test of waiting, a season that no one escapes. I found myself trapped in this very test more times than I could count. Waiting felt like an endless stretch of silence, where prayers seemed to vanish into thin air and promises hung just out of reach. I remember sitting by the window of my little flat in Whitby on a bleak, rainy evening, staring out as the raindrops traced slow paths down the glass. I wondered if God had forgotten me, if my faith was just a fragile thread about to snap. The ache of unanswered prayers was almost unbearable. But what I didn't realize then was that waiting wasn't punishment. It was preparation. God was shaping something deep within me while the world around me stayed still. I learned that waiting strips away our need for control, forcing us to trust not in what we see but in the unseen. It was in those moments that patience began to root itself in my heart and humility softened my pride. 3 tools helped me endure the waiting: clinging to God's promises like lifelines, practicing small acts of faithfulness daily, and leaning into a community that reminded me I wasn't alone. Without friends who would say, "Don't give up," some of those long nights might have broken me. I started to see waiting as a workshop where God quietly refined my heart, teaching me endurance and trust that didn't depend on immediate results. The silence that once terrified me became a sacred space where faith was forged stronger than ever. And though I couldn't see it then, every moment of waiting was a step toward deeper faith, a faith that could withstand any storm. During that long season of waiting, I became close to someone whose story mirrored my own struggles, but who taught me more about faith than I ever expected. His name was James, a man from a nearby town called Harrogate, with a quiet strength beneath a gentle smile. We met at a local support group for those facing hardship, and his journey of faith was like a living example of everything I was learning. James had been a man full of energy and hope, always quick with a kind word and a laugh. But one year everything unraveled. He lost his job without warning, his savings evaporated, and the confidence that once defined him shattered. What hurt him most wasn't the loss itself but the silence that followed. He told me, "I prayed every night, begged God for guidance, but all I heard was silence." At first, his faith was much like mine in the beginning, full of asking and pleading. But as weeks passed without change, something shifted. His prayers softened from demands to quiet surrender. One night, he told me, "I'm done asking God to fix this. I just want him to be here." That moment marked his move from the faith that asks into the faith that trusts. James didn't suddenly find all the answers or a new job. Instead, peace settled over him like a warm, comforting blanket. He started thanking God, not for what was changing, but for what wasn't destroyed: his family, his hope, his faith. "Peace," he said, "is not the result of answered prayers. It's what happens when your heart finally trusts God's hand, even when you can't see the plan." His story gave me hope that faith isn't about quick fixes but about transformation. And in time, as his faith matured, so did mine. James' story didn't end there. One quiet morning, as he read the Gospel of John, he paused on a simple phrase, "Abide in me." It was like a light flickered on inside him. He realized he had been chasing answers, solutions, and miracles so intently that he'd lost sight of what it meant to simply be with God. From that day, his mornings changed. Instead of rushing through lists of requests, he sat quietly with his Bible open, sometimes reading a single verse, sometimes sitting in silence. Slowly, the anxiety that had once gripped him began to loosen its hold. His soul seemed to breathe again. Months later, out of nowhere, a job opportunity appeared. The company that hired him said his name had come up unexpectedly during a meeting, but by then, James wasn't desperate for the job. He was already content. When he shared the news with me, his eyes shone with a calm confidence. "The job isn't the miracle," he said softly. "The miracle already happened inside me." His journey from frantic asking, through trusting silence, to abiding peace changed everything about how he lived his faith. He no longer chased outcomes, he lived from relationship. His story echoed the 3 stages of faith I had come to understand. We start by asking because need drives us. Then we learn to trust when delays teach us dependence. Finally, we abide, living in the presence of God as our deepest joy. James' faith didn't just survive hardship. It grew into something unshakable. His journey gave me a glimpse of what was possible for me, too. No matter where you are in your own faith walk, whether you're still asking, waiting, or beginning to abide, there is hope. Faith is growing even when you can't see it. The silence doesn't mean God is absent. Sometimes, it's the very place where he draws us closer. Looking back on my own story and James's journey, I often ask myself, which level of faith am I truly living in today? It's tempting to think faith is about grand miracles or dramatic breakthroughs, but I've learned it's far more subtle and profound. Faith is a journey that stretches, grows, and transforms us in ways we don't expect. It begins with the faith that asks, a raw, honest cry from a heart in need. That's where most of us start, reaching out because pain or desperation drives us to God's arms. Then comes the faith that trusts, where we hold on even when heaven is silent, learning to rest in God's character rather than our circumstances. And finally, the faith that abides, where we no longer chase answers but live in the steady presence of the answer itself. These stages aren't races to finish but paths to walk with grace. God is patient with all of us, gently guiding us through each season in His perfect time. He doesn't compare your faith to others, nor does He grade you on strength or achievements. What He desires is movement, a heart that keeps growing, leaning, and drawing nearer. Even the smallest seed of faith that continues to reach upward is precious to Him, far more beautiful than pride that refuses to budge. If you're in the season of asking right now, don't be ashamed of your need. Cry out honestly, but then linger a little longer in the quiet after your prayers. Listen for the whisper behind the silence. If you're in the waiting season, hold fast to God's promises. Stay faithful in the small things and remember that silence is the soil where trust takes root. And if you've reached the place of abiding, let your life become the living testimony of what it means to rest in God's love. True faith isn't measured by how quickly miracles appear, but by how deeply peace remains when they don't. The storms around us may rage, but a heart that abides in Christ will not be moved. So, the real question isn't just where your faith is today, it's where you're willing to go next. Because God is always calling us deeper, not to test our strength but to draw us closer to His heart. And sometimes, that peace itself is the greatest miracle of all.